For a long time, the traditional story of history was that early humans, or Homo sapiens, left Africa and easily took over the world because they were smarter and had better technology than other groups. However, a new look at archaeological and climate evidence suggests a completely different reality. Instead of humans being the powerful conquerors, it appears that Neanderthals were actually the established power in Europe. The long period from roughly 125,000 to 60,000 years ago was not a time when humans were conquering the world. Instead, it was a time of a massive, lasting siege. During this era, the Neanderthals were the true power in Europe. They effectively defended a fortress Europe against a dangerous and expanding empire arriving from the east, the Denisovans. The real reason humans left Africa was a sudden and severe climate collapse, not a desire for glory or exploration. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, the lush green corridors that once connected Africa to the rest of the world dried up and turned into harsh deserts. Climate data from ancient marine sediments shows that the region shifted from a habitable grassland to a hyper-arid wasteland. This environmental disaster forced the human populations living near the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa to flee their homes to escape starvation. While an earlier warm period had created a green corridor of grass and water across the Sahara and Arabia, the beginning of an ice age around 70,000 to 60,000 years ago destroyed these ecosystems. Evidence from deep under the ocean floor shows a sudden and harsh change during this time. The region shifted from a wet, grassy home into a totally dry desert, essentially shutting the door on the African continent. This created a massive push to leave. The humans living near the Red Sea weren't explorers looking for adventure, they were climate refugees running away from starvation. As the Middle East dried up, the land bridge connecting Africa to the rest of the world became a narrow, desperate bottleneck. While the Neanderthals up north lived in stable, rich lands, the areas where humans lived became dangerous traps with no food. This migration was a fight for survival that pushed humans right up against the southern borders of Neanderthal territory in the Middle East and the Zagros Mountains. They didn't arrive there as an army of conquerors, but as a broken, starving group looking for safety in a land ruled by giants. While the south collapsed, the east was rising. The Denisovan populations, centered in the Altai Mountains and expanding onto the Tibetan Plateau and into the steppes of Central Asia, represent a hominin lineage of terrifying capability. Far from being a marginal group, genetic and fossil evidence suggests the Denisovans possessed a dragon phenotype, massive, robust, and adapted to extremes that would kill other humans. The discovery of the Harbin cranium, also called Dragon Man, provides the face of this enemy, a species with a brain capacity equal to or exceeding modern humans, housed in a skull of immense thickness and structural integrity. Armed with genetic adaptations for high-altitude endurance and a material culture that included the world's first tailored clothing, the Denisovans were uniquely positioned to dominate the geography of Inner Asia. Their expansion westward, driven by their own population pressures and the high caloric demands of their physiology, brought them into direct conflict with the eastern flank of the Neanderthal territory. To understand the mechanics of the Denisovan War, one must first analyse the biological and technological assets of the three distinct hominin groups involved. This was a conflict where biology was destiny and where physiological traits dictated military doctrine. Neanderthals were the undisputed masters of Western Eurasia, and for good reason. They weren't just surviving the Ice Age, they were built for it. You should think of them less like primitive cavemen and more like organic tanks. Their bodies were designed for shock warfare, up-close and violent combat. They had incredibly thick bones, barrel chests, and massive upper body muscles that acted like natural armour, protecting their organs during fights. Scientists have found that Neanderthals often had healed fractures in their heads and necks, looking exactly like the injuries modern rodeo riders get. This tells us they frequently fought massive creatures or enemies up close, got smashed, and survived to fight another day. In a hand-to-hand fight, a Neanderthal was a nightmare opponent. Their low centre of gravity and crushing grip strength allowed them to hold their ground against larger groups, operating like a wall of heavy infantry. Forget the movie trope of the grunting brute. New science suggests Neanderthals had a sophisticated way of communicating, which gave them a tactical edge. Their vocal tracts likely produced high-pitched, piercing voices. In a loud, chaotic battle with wind and rain, a deep voice gets drowned out, but a high-pitched shout cuts right through the noise. They weren't just shrieking in anger. Their ears were tuned to hear speech just like ours. This means they could shout specific orders, like coordinates for an ambush, or commands to hold the line, that their troops could hear clearly over the din of battle. The Neanderthals were also master engineers who knew how to use their terrain. The best example of this is the Bruniquel cave in France. Deep inside this cave, over 300 meters from the entrance, they built complex rings made of broken stalagmites. This changes how we view them. They didn't just sleep in caves, they turned them into fortresses. By building deep underground, they created bunkers. If the Denisovan army attacked, the Neanderthals could retreat into these deep citadels. The narrow tunnels would force the enemy to attack single file, nullifying their numbers and forcing them into a suicidal fight against a Neanderthal shield wall. If Neanderthals were the immovable object, Denisovans were the irresistible force. While their fossil record is more fragmentary, the available evidence paints a picture of a hominin lineage optimized for expansion and dominance in the harshest environments on Earth. The Harbin cranium, assigned to Homo longi and widely considered to represent the Denisovan lineage, reveals a skull of massive proportions. The face is flat but huge, with a jaw capable of exerting tremendous bite force. The cranial capacity of 1,420 cubic centimeters is at par with modern humans and Neanderthals, indicating that this was a war of equals in terms of raw intelligence. The defining physical trait of the Denisovan, however, was likely sheer size. The robustness of the available teeth and jaw fragments exceeds even that of the Neanderthals. In hand-to-hand combat, a Denisovan would have been a terrifying adversary, possessing the reach and mass to break a Neanderthal formation. The most significant strategic asset of the Denisovan Empire was genetic. The EPAS1 gene variant, found in high frequencies in Denisovan DNA and introgressed into modern Tibetans, regulates hemoglobin production to prevent polycythemia, thickening of the blood, at high altitudes. For a Neanderthal or sapiens, fighting at altitudes above 3,000 meters entails hypoxia, fatigue, cognitive decline, and the risk of stroke. For a Denisovan, the roof of the world was home. This biological adaptation allowed Denisovan armies to utilize the mountain ranges of the Altai, the Pamirs, and the Himalayas not as barriers, but as highways. They could flank Neanderthal defenses in the lowlands by traversing the high passes, descending upon the valleys from unexpected vectors. This militarization of the high ground forced the Neanderthals to maintain a constant, exhausting 360-degree defense. The Denisovans of the Altai possessed a material culture that rivaled the upper Paleolithic industries of the West. The discovery of a 50,000-year-old eyed needle made of bird bone in Denisova cave is a smoking gun for advanced logistical capability. An eyed needle implies tailored, multi-layered clothing, pants, parkas, and boots that fit snugly to retain heat. This is a military revolution. It allowed Denisovan forces to campaign in the depths of the Siberian winter, extending their operational season into months where Neanderthals, reliant on simpler draped furs, would be forced to hole up in their caves. Furthermore, the Denisovan lithic industry shows a preference for micro-blades and composite tools, suggesting weaponry designed to cause massive bleeding, serrated edges that would shred the unarmoured flesh of sapiens refugees or the heavy muscle of Neanderthals. Homo sapiens arriving in the Levant around 60,000 BP were physically unimposing compared to the Eurasian giants. Gracile, thin-boned, and lacking cold adaptations, they appeared to be the weakest faction. However, their desperation drove innovation, and they possessed two capabilities that would eventually tip the balance of the war. While Neanderthals and Denisovans relied on thrusting or short-range thrown spears, sapiens introduced the atlatl, or spear thrower. This lever-arm technology magnified the force of the human wrist, allowing a dart to be thrown with lethal accuracy at ranges exceeding 90 meters. This introduced the concept of standoff capability. In the open steppes or desert margins, sapien skirmishers could harass Denisovan columns from a distance, inflicting casualties without ever entering the lethal reach of the Denisovan melee weapons. This was asymmetric warfare in its purest Pleistocene form. Neanderthal groups were traditionally smaller and more insular than modern humans. This made coordinating large-scale campaigns difficult. Homo sapiens, with a social cognition adapted for larger groups, acted as the nervous system of the alliance. They could maintain trade networks, convey messages between disparate Neanderthal clans, and coordinate logistics across hundreds of kilometers. The refugees became the signal corps and the supply masters, knitting the fractured Neanderthal resistance into a cohesive front. The narrative of the sapiens' conquest ignores the fundamental paleo-ecological reality of marine isotope stage 4 and 3. The movement of Homo sapiens out of Africa was not an explosion of vitality, but a leakage of dying populations. Around 60,000 years ago, the orbital precession cycles that drive the African monsoon shifted, plunging northeast Africa into hyper-aridity. The lakes dried up, the game herds vanished, and the green Sahara turned to dust. The human populations that had thrived there were forced toward the coasts and the narrow isthmus of Suez. This migration was driven by starvation. The archaeological signal of this is found in the sudden, pulsed appearances of sapiens technology in the Levant, often followed by disappearances, failed colonies that could not sustain themselves. The survivors of this trek arrived at the gates of Eurasia traumatized and destitute. The Levant, and specifically sites like School and Kafse, served as the primary contact zone. Previously interpreted as sites where sapiens and Neanderthals took turns occupying the caves based on climate, sapiens in warm periods, Neanderthals in cold, the Denisovan war model reinterprets this as a zone of negotiation and integration. The Neanderthals, facing demographic attrition from the endless war on their eastern front in the Caucasus and Caspian, initially viewed the sapiens as encroachers. However, the strategic calculus shifted. The sapiens were weak, yes, but they were numerous, and they hated the cold, meaning they wouldn't compete for the prime Neanderthal real estate in the deep north. More importantly, they possessed the atlatl. The southern refugees were allowed to settle the buffer zones of the Levant and the Balkans, serving as a first line of defense, a marcher-lord population that absorbed the initial blows of any southern Denisovan flanking maneuvers. The stalemate of the Denisovan War was broken not by a single battle, but by the integration of Neanderthal and sapiens capabilities. This was a lend-lease program of the Paleolithic.
One of the most critical transfers of technology was the Neanderthal secret of birch tar.
This adhesive, produced through a complex dry distillation process requiring anaerobic conditions and precise temperature control, was the first synthetic material in history. For the sapiens refugees, birch tar was a revelation. Their own adhesives, gums and resins, were brittle and temperature sensitive. The sapiens' atlatl darts, when tipped with stone points hafted with Neanderthal birch tar, became armor-piercing missiles. The tar prevented the points from shattering or detaching upon high-velocity impact with the thick Denisovan clothing or bone. In return, sapiens likely provided the lighter, straighter shafts and the fletching technology required for accurate projectile flight. The Neanderthal capacity for medical care is well documented. The individual Shanid R1 survived severe head trauma, partial blindness, and a withered arm for decades, cared for by his group. This evidences a society with deep emotional bonds and a sophisticated knowledge of trauma care. The sapiens refugees, coming from a harsh survival of the fittest migration, absorbed this ethos. The humanity, often attributed solely to sapiens, compassion, ritual burial, care for the weak, was likely a Neanderthal cultural export. In the context of the war, this medical capability was logistical. It meant that veteran soldiers, both Neanderthal and sapiens, could be healed and returned to the fight, preserving valuable combat experience that the Denisovans, with their survival of the strong approach, might have discarded. The genetic evidence of interbreeding is the most enduring record of this alliance. The fact that all non-African modern humans carry 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA is not the result of random trysts, but of systematic integration. Crucially, the genes retained from Neanderthals relate to the immune system and keratin production for skin and hair toughness. The sapiens refugees needed the Neanderthal immune system to survive the pathogens of Eurasia. They needed Neanderthal skin adaptations to survive the cold. The hybrids, the children of the Alliance, were the super soldiers of the late Pleistocene, possessing sapiens agility, Neanderthal immunity, and the combined cognitive toolkit of both species. The war was fought along a massive shifting frontier defined by the natural barriers of Eurasia, with the Caspian Sea acting as the pivot point. Because sea levels were rising at the time, the sea expanded significantly, acting as a giant wall that split the war into 2 distinct fronts. To the north, the land was a flat, grassy steppe, often called tank country. This terrain favoured the Denisovans, whose shock troops could move rapidly across the open ground, forcing the Neanderthals to use the Ural and Volga rivers as natural moats to break the enemy's momentum. To the south, the situation was different. The land between the sea and the Alborz Mountains narrowed into a strategic choke point. Here, the Alliance set a deadly trap. Homo sapiens archers stationed themselves on the high cliffs to rain darts down on the enemy columns, while Neanderthal heavy infantry held the narrow beaches below, creating an impassable wall of defence. In the mountains, biology dictated strategy. The Denisovans possessed the high-altitude gene that allowed them to thrive in thin air, giving them uncontested control of the Tibetan Plateau and the high peaks. The Alliance realised they could not fight effectively above 4,000 metres, so they ceded the heights and fortified the valley floors instead. This created a vertical border where the Denisovans ruled the peaks, but could not descend without losing their advantage. Any Denisovan raid that lingered too long in the oxygen-rich lowlands became vulnerable to the superior stamina and ambush tactics of the Alliance. In the frozen north near the Ural Mountains, the conflict turned into a test of endurance. The Denisovans initially held the advantage because they had invented tailored clothing to survive the deep freeze. However, the Neanderthals were quick learners. They captured and reverse-engineered Denisovan technology, specifically bone needles and awls. By copying these warm clothes, the Neanderthals were able to hold their ground through the brutal winters, preventing the enemy from flanking them and encircling their European fortress. We can reconstruct the terrifying reality of these battles, which relied on a combined arms approach to beat the physically superior Denisovans. The engagement would begin with the anvil, Homo sapiens skirmishers using spear throwers to attack from a distance of 50 to 80 metres. Their goal wasn't necessarily to kill, but to wound and disrupt the enemy formation. Once the Denisovans were agitated, the sapiens would feign a retreat, luring the enraged giants into a prepared kill zone like a box canyon or a marsh. Once the trap was set, the hammer would drop. Neanderthal heavy infantry, who had been lying in wait with camouflage, would spring the ambush from extremely close range. Using their explosive upper body strength and heavy thrusting spears, they would crash into the disorganized Denisovan ranks, negating the enemy's size advantage through surprise and ferocity. The Alliance weaponized every aspect of the environment, including sound and food. Neanderthals likely utilized high-pitched, resonant war screams to trigger startle reflexes in their enemies, while sapiens used complex language and silent hand signals to ensure perfect timing. Ultimately, however, the war was decided by calories. The massive bodies of the Denisovans required an enormous amount of food to function, likely far more than the resources of the frozen steppe could provide. The Alliance didn't need to win every battle. They simply had to outlast the dragon men in a war of attrition, letting starvation destroy the invading empire. The Denisovan War did not end with a treaty, but with a gradual assimilation. The 50,000-year stalemate exhausted the Denisovan Empire. As the climate warmed and the glaciers retreated during the interstadials, the demographic weight of the Alliance began to tell. The genetic record shows a pulse of Denisovan introgression in East Asian and Papuan populations. This likely represents the final phase of the war. The Alliance, now a thoroughly hybridized population of sapiens and Neanderthals pushing east. They didn't wipe out the Denisovans, they absorbed them. The sapiens who moved into Tibet and the Pacific acquired the essential Denisovan traits, effectively capturing the biological assets of their defeated enemy. The Neanderthals were not wiped out, they were the victims of their own success. By opening their borders to the sapiens refugees to win the war, they sealed their demographic fate. The sapiens population grew faster, and through generations of interbreeding, the distinct Neanderthal morphology was submerged into the hybrid genome. They didn't die out, they just married into the families of the refugees they saved, the children of the war. Modern humanity is not the product of a single African tribe conquering the world. We are the survivors of a world war. Our genome is a war record. Neanderthal genes for defense and immunity, Denisovan genes for altitude and endurance, and sapiens genes for social cohesion and adaptability. The Europe of the Upper Paleolithic was a fortress held by the Neanderthals, and it was their shield combined with the sapien spear that forged the future. The Denisovans are presented as a physically formidable tank species, possessing thick skulls resistant to blunt force and immense jaw strength. This forced the Alliance to innovate with piercing stone-tipped weaponry. Biologically, the Denisovans held a high ground advantage. The high-altitude adaptation allowed them to breathe in thin mountain air and flank their enemies from above, which the Alliance countered by staying in lower altitudes where air pressure served as a natural barrier. The Neanderthals provided the Alliance with logistical and emotional depth, utilising deep earth bunkers like Bruniquel Cave for secure operations, and maintaining high unit morale through close-knit social bonds. In combat, they contributed acoustic shock by using high-frequency vocalizations to stun enemies. When paired with the complex planning and linguistic coordination of Homo sapiens, this interspecies synergy allowed the Alliance to execute the synchronized, lethal ambushes that ultimately won the war.